Let's do it. Let's do it. And I say that because, you know what, it's so brief to my response to that fucking video, my response to those who like to say that the Civil War was about states' rights versus being about slavery and everything else. And I just have one simple question to everybody out there who believes that. If you want to say that the Civil War was about states' rights, then I have one question. States' rights to what? States' rights to what? That's all.
And I agree. But let's play the clip. Let's do it. So this is a clip from RT. It's only about a minute, so here you go.
Millions of children in the U.S. will be taught a warped version of history. That's the fear of the Washington Post. The newspaper claims new textbooks to be used in schools in Texas downplay racial segregation in America's past. Well, the new book suggests that slavery was not the main cause of the U.S. Civil War, but rather that it was the southern states' fight for their rights. There was also reportedly not a word about the white supremacist movement, the Ku Klux Klan. Education Standards campaigner Raul Savalos, who studied in Texas, says the new books contradict the historical truth.
I was in school in Texas. I grew up here, and I was taught that slavery was the main reason for the war. I believe that a lot of it comes down to what the teacher teaches. If the teacher is going to teach the students that slavery was the biggest issue, then that's what the students will learn, regardless of what the textbooks say. Now, obviously, like I said, the textbooks, they are going to reflect what the elected officials think, but I think at the end of the day, the teachers will decide what their students learn, and I believe that the students will eventually understand as well that slavery was the main reason.
Meanwhile, the infamous KKK, who are omitted from the school books in Texas, are still thriving.
And there it is. So, Adamizer.
Yes, sir.
I believe you said, before we played the clip was, and I think rightfully so, right? The question of, well, if you think it was states' rights, it was states' rights from or for what?
States' rights to what exactly? Answer that question with a word other than slavery, and there's a conversation to be had. But I think that was absolutely the only state right that was on anybody's lips at the time of the Civil War. And if I'm mistaken or misinformed, I'm always open to that. But, I think that's the question you have to ask yourself. States' rights to what?
I would actually like to have a larger conversation about this. I mean, I'll be honest, I would like to research it first. You know what I mean? I'm not going to start a huge argument, but I do know that, there were federal rights and states' rights. There was the idea of nullification. The states wanted to nullify federal acts that they deemed unconstitutional, and, the federal government denied this to the states, and they fought for it tooth and nail. But then, you look at the slave and non-slave states, and you look at they just invented the cotton gin, and that people think, well, that was a good reason to not have to, but you needed more cheap labor because the cotton gin could, help produce more cotton, help pick it faster, but you needed people to work those things and to still be in the field. So the need for cheap labor was increased, I think, but I just don't think it's right to diminish it and say that it was simply about slavery, because I don't think that that's true. But to say that wasn't a huge part of it is ignorant as well.
Well, let me just ask another question that I think plays here, which is this. If it were not for the disagreements between the specifically on the issue of slavery, between southern states that were profiting highly from slavery and northern states that had all but abolished it, would there have been a war?
Good question.
I don't know. Maybe. Like I said, I don't want to put my foot in my mouth. I would rather research it a bit more before I argue the point.
That's the angle, though, that I want to go down. Because, for me, right, it was about states' rights and slavery. Okay? why does one have to be diminished? Why does one have to be taught over the other? Okay, why do we have to choose? All right, and here's what I'm getting at. Okay, what if instead of the war, okay, the Civil War that ultimately broke out, what if these southern states, these states with slavery, were allowed their constitutional right to secede for whatever reason, right? And yes, it was for slavery. And I'll have you know that I think it's a really interesting read myself, but I'm kind of a history guy, but I didn't really ever think before of going to read these, right? But you can go online and read. So whenever, as each state seceded, right? They all, I don't know the actual word for it, but they all, produced their declaration, or they all kind of formally wrote up.
Articles of Confederation.
Well, I think that's when they joined together, right? But so I think like South Carolina was the first ones, I think, to actually secede from the Union. And, so they produced this thing of why they're leaving. And you can go and look, and pretty much all of them point to slavery as the reason, right? There were offshoots because of slavery, like, for example, kind of like the Dred Scott case, but if not so much, because he was brought over into a free state by his master. But so if a slave escaped and made it to a free state, they weren't handing him back over, right? Which they were saying was, bullshit, right? So it very much, obviously, it supports what you're saying, Adamizer, in terms of, at the end of the day, yes, slavery was the dominating, foremost issue that was dividing the nation, right? But again, what I'm starting to ponder here, and I don't have all the shit that I really want yet as well, but I sit there and say, well, what if, right, they were allowed to secede, okay?
I don't think that ever would have happened. Because the president is sworn to uphold the Constitution. If you secede, then the Constitution is null and void in your eyes. It's a dead document.
No.
Right?
Well,
if you secede,
really, right? Well, for them, check it out. And here's my thinking behind this, right? Is what ultimately would have happened is we would have looked, the United States would have looked a lot more like Europe, right? Because, and this is the thinking that you kind of got to take into this, right? So when we had the American Revolution, and when we declared our independence from Britain, okay, and before the Constitution was officially ratified, what it was, those 13 states were basically individual nations. It was kind of like, traditional Europe, maybe not so much more with the European Union, right? But, Virginia was like its own little country. South Carolina was its own country. Massachusetts was its own country, right? And they all had their own constitutions and everything like that. And so what does the Constitution do? And, and these are all the questions that you got to answer. So what the Constitution is doing and saying is all these states are saying, okay, we have our ways of doing things, and we have our this, and we have our that. We're willing to give a little of our liberties, whatever, away, our state, our power away to this centralized government, right? And, in order so that all the states can do a little better, right? We're willing to live under these sets of rules where there's a Congress and a president and, and those other set rules that we have agreed to, which are all the amendments, right? So we agree to those. Okay, so but what happened, right, was that, and when that was ratified, right, slavery was legal. It was the law of the land. And so these states are saying, well, no, if you're going to take this away from me, fuck you, right? Now, I agree with you, Adamizer, with regard to, yeah, the North obviously had the moral high ground and everything else like that. But what if, right, as opposed to going to war, they were allowed to secede? Then what would have happened is that power of the state, the individual state, would have cemented and become much stronger, right? States would have had a much more individualistic, failing on the word here, but they would have, again, they all would have been more like,
they could nullify, like I said, it was
right?
Nullification. They could nullify federal rulings.
Now, you can play it out as to what would have happened, because certainly with the way it did play out, with the loss of 500,000 lives just in Army soldiers on both sides, and, of course, the destruction, the amount of wounded, all that. Well, what happened as a result of it? Well, we kind of know, right, that because we felt bad for the South and all this other shit, then we ultimately allowed all the Jim Crow laws and the segregation and all that bullshit, and it ultimately probably set race relations and all that other shit back the 100 years that it did. Whereas if that didn't happen, okay, maybe they have actual slavery for a little bit longer, but let's face it, right? Even in the states where slavery was the most prevalent, I think there are two that actually hit about 50% of the people actually owned slaves. For the most part of the 13 states that seceded, you're usually talking about 20-25% of the population that actually owned slaves, right? I think just given time, and certainly the North could have put on economic sanctions, right? Maybe we could have learned this lesson that we should know today. When we're talking about everyone walking around with their fucking iPhones and everything else from China, made in factories that have suicide nets around them, or made in Malaysia with all but fucking slave labor, right? Maybe we could have learned the lesson of being able to fucking talk with our wallet and said, you know what, we're not buying your shit, South. We're just not fucking buying it. And maybe that, with a combination of, again, a majority of the Southerners who don't own slaves, and probably a majority of the Southerners who thought that slavery was the bogus, fucking, disgusting, inhumane thing that it was, it naturally would have, eliminated slavery there, say, by the 1900s, and then we wouldn't have had to go through that fucking extra 60, 70, 80 years of the bullshit that it ended up being, right? So, again, to kind of just cycle back around, it's like, well, why can't both these things be taught as super important? Because that states' rights issue, to blow it off and say it wasn't a thing, well, it was a fucking thing, right? And it's very important for us to know that as a people, as a state, however you want to put it, if you feel, and collectively, that the centralized federal government is stomping on your rights, is taxing without representing, any of that shit, well, then you're able to fucking pull away from them. And it's an idea and a theory that is so far removed from us today that, again, I feel like obviously we can play the what-if game with a lot of things, but if it did go down that route, well, shit, maybe we wouldn't be in the other fucking messes we are right now.
Well, I think you raise an excellent question and an excellent point here. However, there's a couple of things that I have to throw out there. First of all, the fact that the majority of people in the South did not own slaves did not mean that the majority of people in the South were against slavery. That was more a condition of economics, the fact that most people couldn't afford to own slaves. So you talk about, well, what about all these folks in the South in these seceding states who didn't agree with slavery because they didn't own slaves? I don't think that's the case. I think that the majority of people in the southern states did agree with slavery. That was part of what happened. But minor point. I think the bigger point in getting to your question here is what would it look like? And I think the answer quite simply is that we'd have 50 different nations, okay? Because if you let the South secede over that, then everybody would have been seceding from everybody over everything. And I think that, again, we would be much more of a Europe-style, and maybe nowadays we'd come back to the idea of some sort of European Union kind of agreement that's, not necessarily quite as federal as we are, but nonetheless is we're trying to work together on certain levels. However, here's the thing that concerns me about it is that now, number one, I would absolutely be happy if the actions that are going on in my state weren't dragged down by the actions going on in places like fucking Texas, okay? We talked earlier about how the school book aspect plays into Texas, and a lot of people don't realize this, but Texas and I don't know if it's California or Florida, I can't remember off the top of my head, because they purchase so many more school books than everybody else, they actually drive the what's in the school books for most of the nation, because the largest purchasers are the people who dictate content for the smaller purchases. So even living here in New Hampshire, our textbooks and many other things would be affected by what goes on in Texas and other places where they believe the Civil War is still happening in a lot of ways. Not to mention the fact that here I am in New Hampshire having to deal with the fact that Koch brothers are spending money on the Free State Project. Okay, now the Koch brothers don't live in New Hampshire. And if we were 50 separate nations, or even 2 separate nations, even if we want to take it to the other extreme, okay, and they were part of that other nation, I wouldn't have to deal with their bullshit. They'd be off doing that in some other nation. There are certainly pros to that aspect, and I'm not going to sit here and deny that. But at the same time, I feel like we have to accept the fact that for all of the instances where, again, the Koch brothers are sponsoring the Free State Project here in New Hampshire and are bringing down, the southern states are basically bringing down the northern states, that the northern states have brought up the southern states in quite a bit, that, the anti-slavery laws, for example, are one way in which that works. And not just anti-slavery laws, but anti-discrimination laws, so on and so forth. I think that, you talk about, well, would we have progressed faster as far as, civil rights and things like that? Certainly in some states we would have. Certainly in the North, even if it was just a two-country division, we'd let the South secede and become their own nation, and the North stayed its own nation. We were only talking about 2 nations. Civil rights would have progressed a lot faster in the North, but where would they be in the South right now? So I think you have to look at it from that perspective and realize that, it would certainly be a lot better in some places, but unquestionably, I think it would be a lot worse in others. And and just to throw out the overall aspect here as we're winding down, because of course a lot of this centers right now on the idea of the Confederate flag. If people start telling you can't wave a Confederate flag on your property, I will lend you my ear and I will have that discussion with you. That's getting to a point that would concern me to a certain degree. Basically, if you want to be a racist or just ignorant of why the Civil War happened and you want to fly that flag on your property, go right ahead. Nobody's saying that you can't. But the only issue at hand right now is whether it should be flown over public buildings and the fact that certain stores and businesses have decided not to sell it, based on their own rights. I don't see a problem with this. I see a problem if people are telling you, hey, you can't fly it or whatever else, but the fact that some businesses aren't doing it, the fact that, some TV stations are pulling the Dukes of Hazzard. I'm sorry, I enjoyed the Dukes of Hazzard growing up, too. I feel nostalgic about it. But at the same time, you know what? It really wasn't that great a show. Come on, you know what I mean? Who the fuck cares? We're moved on to the post Twin Peaks
Adamizer,
days.
we got our last 5 seconds here, so we got to stop it there.
Thank
you for tuning in to the Front Row with the Freak Show. We'll pick it up again next week. Don't worry. I think you can be sure of that. But for tonight, anyway, that's it. I'm Crafty. He's Adamizer and Bax. Thanks for tuning in. You freaks be good now. You hear?